Eleanor Whitmore walked past every eligible bachelor in that ballroom and knelt down beside the one man Boston had already buried. The laughter behind her cut off mid-breath. Nathaniel Ashford looked up at her, bracing for the pity he'd learned to expect from every soul in that room. She didn't give him pity. She gave him her hand in front of the family that had promised her to someone else. Before you see what she did next, hit subscribe so you don't lose this story, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. The fiddles stopped first, then the laughter. Then everything in that room went quiet enough that Eleanor Whitmore could hear her own heartbeat pounding against the whalebone of her corset, and she thought, good, let them all stare. Let every last one of them see exactly what I'm about to do. She had walked 20 feet across a polished ballroom floor in front of 300 of Boston's finest families, and not one of them had moved to stop her because not one of them believed she would actually do it. "Miss Whitmore," Cornelius Hale's voice cracked through the silence like a whip. "Where in heaven's name do you think you're going?" She didn't turn around. She kept walking toward the far wall, toward the chair nobody wanted to stand near, toward the man they'd wheeled into the corner like a piece of broken furniture. Nobody had the heart to throw out, and nobody had the courage to look at straight on. Nathaniel Ashford saw her coming, and his whole body went rigid. "Don't," he said low before she'd even reached him. "Whatever you're fixing to do, ma'am, don't." "I already decided," Eleanor said. "Decided what?" She stopped in front of his chair, and the whole room held its breath with her. Somewhere behind her, she heard Cornelius Hale say her name again, sharper this time. And she heard her mother's voice crack out, "Eleanor," like a slap. And she heard the low, ugly murmur of 200 conversations, all turning into one single question. Is she really? And she knelt down. Right there. In front of God and Boston, and her own intended husband. She knelt down so her eyes were level with his. "You'll dance with him!" A woman's voice rang out from somewhere near the punch table, high and cruel and delighted the way people get delighted when they smell a scandal coming. "Eleanor Whitmore, you cannot be serious." Eleanor didn't look at the woman. She looked at Nathaniel. "Yes," she said. "I will." The room exploded into whispers. Somewhere a glass shattered against the floor. Nathaniel's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter, and his hands, folded tight in his lap, went white at the knuckles. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "You don't know what they'll say about you tomorrow morning. You don't know what your mama's gonna do to you when you get home tonight." "I know exactly what they'll say," Eleanor said. "I've been listening to what people say about me my whole life, Mr. Ashford. I stopped caring what they said a long time ago." "They ain't laughing at you," he said. "They're laughing at me. There's a difference." "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight, they're laughing at both of us, so we might as well give them a real reason." She stood and she held out her hand, palm up. The way you'd offer a hand to a man standing on solid ground. Not a man folded into a chair with wheels bolted to its legs. Not a hand offered in charity. A hand offered like an invitation. Nathaniel stared at it like it might bite him. "I can't dance," he said. The words came out rougher than he meant them to. "In case you ain't noticed, Miss Whitmore, my legs don't work the way they used to." "I noticed," she said. "I asked you to dance with me. I didn't ask you to waltz." Somebody near the wall laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh quickly smothered. Nathaniel's eyes flicked past her shoulder to the crowd, to every face he'd spent the last 8 months avoiding, every face that had once tipped a hat to him on the street and now crossed to the other side rather than look him in the eye. "They're all watching," he said. "Let them. You don't understand what it cost me to stop caring about that." "Then let me help you not care about it for 5 minutes," Eleanor said. "Take my hand, Nathaniel Ashford, and I will wheel you out onto that floor myself, and we will do something with this dance that nobody in this room has ever seen before, and tomorrow they can talk about it all they like." His chest rose and fell once hard. "Why?" he said. It wasn't really a question, or it was the only question, the one underneath every other word. "Why in the hell would you do this to yourself?" "Because somebody in this room ought to remember you're still a man," she said, and not a piece of broken crockery they're too polite to sweep up. For a moment, neither of them moved. The whole ballroom hung there, suspended 300 people forgetting to breathe. Then Nathaniel Ashford reached up and he took her hand.
Sincerity.
The murmurs followed them all the way across the floor. Eleanor pushed his chair herself. She wouldn't let a footman do it, wouldn't let anyone else touch this moment. And when they reached the center of the room, where the other dancers had already backed away to give them space, some out of courtesy and some out of the particular cruelty of wanting a clear view, she came around and stood in front of him. "I don't know what you think we're about to do," Nathaniel said. "Neither do I," Eleanor admitted. "But I know we're not standing here like two people waiting to be forgiven for existing." She held out both her hands. He looked at them a long moment, and something in his face cracked open. Not softened, not yet, but cracked the way ice cracks before it finally gives, and he took them both. The fiddler. God blessed him understood what was being asked of him without a word spoken. He picked up something slow, something that didn't need feet, something built for hands and turning, and the particular grace of two people choosing each other in front of a crowd that expected them to fail. Eleanor turned Nathaniel's chair in a slow half-circle, her hands in his, and for 4 minutes the ballroom watched a broken man and a ruined woman. Because that's what they called her too, whether she'd earned it or not, move through something that wasn't quite a dance and wasn't quite defiance, and was somehow both at once. When the music ended, nobody clapped. Nobody dared be first. Eleanor didn't care. She leaned down close enough that only he could hear her. "There," she said. "Now let them talk." Her mother found her in the coat room 20 minutes later, and Margaret Whitmore's face had gone the particular shade of red that meant the scolding was going to be quiet and vicious rather than loud and quick. "Do you have any notion?" Margaret said, low gripping Eleanor's arm hard enough to bruise, "Any notion at all what you have done tonight? I danced with a man, Mother. You danced with the Ashford cripple in front of Cornelius Hale and his entire family 3 weeks before your wedding is to be announced." Margaret's fingers dug in tighter. "Do you understand what that man's family is worth to us? Do you understand what happens to this family if the Hales decide you have humiliated their son in front of half of Boston? I didn't humiliate anybody. You knelt down in front of him, Eleanor. You knelt. Because he is a man in a chair, Mother, not a man on his knees. There is no shame in meeting someone where they stand." Margaret's hand came up like she might strike her, and then visibly she pulled it back, because striking her daughter in a coat room where anyone might walk in was its own kind of scandal. And scandal was the one thing Margaret Whitmore feared more than sin itself. "Your father is going to hear about this," she said instead. "And Cornelius Hale is standing in that ballroom right now deciding whether he still wants to marry you." "Then let him decide," Eleanor said, and something in her own voice surprised her steadier than she felt, harder than she'd meant it to be. "I never asked him to want me in the first place. That arrangement was yours and Father's built over brandy and land deeds, same as every arrangement in this family's history." "You ungrateful girl." Margaret's voice cracked. "Do you think men like Cornelius Hale grow on trees? Do you think there is an endless supply of good families willing to take a daughter your age? With your temperament? With your reputation for saying whatever fool thing comes into your head? I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that I would rather be unmarried at 40 than married to a man who looked at Nathaniel Ashford tonight and saw nothing but an embarrassment to be pitied." Margaret stared at her daughter like she was seeing a stranger. "This is that Ashford boy's doing. He's turned your head with his tragedy." "He didn't ask me for anything, Mother. I offered." "Then you're a fool twice over." Margaret straightened her gloves, composing herself back into the shape a room full of watching eyes expected of her. "You will go back out there. You will apologize to Cornelius. You will smile, and you will dance with him next. And you will make certain every soul in that ballroom understands that tonight was nothing more than an act of Christian charity toward a poor, unfortunate man, and nothing more." "I won't lie about it," Eleanor said. "Then you will ruin this family," Margaret said, and walked out. Odd. Cornelius Hale was waiting for her by the punch table when she came back into the ballroom, his jaw set tight, His eyes doing that particular calculation men like him always did, weighing what a thing cost against what it was worth to be seen holding on to it. "That was quite a display," he said. "It wasn't meant to be a display. Everything in that room is a display, Eleanor. You of all people ought to know that by now." He glanced past her toward the corner where Nathaniel's chair still sat a servant, now hovering uselessly nearby, uncertain whether to approach him or leave him be. "People are already saying you've lost your senses over a cripple." "Don't call him that." "That is what he is. That is not all he is," Eleanor said, and heard her own voice rise, and didn't care who heard it. "He was the finest horseman in this county before that accident. He built half the schoolhouses between here and Worcester with his own money, and never once put his name on a plaque. He reads more books than every man in this room combined, and he has more decency in one useless leg than you have in your entire body, Cornelius Hale." Something flickered behind Cornelius's eyes. Not hurt exactly. Calculation again. A man recalculating the odds. "You're in love with him," he said, like it disgusted him and fascinated him in equal measure. "I've spoken to him twice in my life," Eleanor said. "Tonight and once at church. I am not in love with him. I am ashamed of every person in this room who decided a carriage accident made him less of a man, and I was not willing to be one more coward standing by while it happened." "Careful," Cornelius said, and his voice went soft in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. "You've made an enemy of my family tonight whether you meant to or not. My mother does not forget an insult, and neither do I." "I didn't insult you. You will find," he said, stepping closer, close enough that she could smell the brandy on his breath, "that in this town insult isn't always about what's said. Sometimes it's about what's chosen. And tonight, in front of everyone who matters, you chose him instead of me." He walked away before she could answer, and Eleanor stood alone by the punch table with her pulse hammering and her hands shaking in a way she hoped nobody could see, and she understood with a cold certainty, settling low in her stomach, that she had just made a very dangerous man very unhappy. She found Nathaniel again near the far doors, where a servant was making a slow, awkward business of trying to get his chair through a gap too narrow for its wheels. "Let me," Eleanor said, and took the handles before the servant could protest. "You don't have to keep doing that," Nathaniel said. "Doing what?" "Rescuing me in front of a crowd." "I'm not rescuing you," she said, working the chair through the doorway with more strength than her dress sleeves suggested she had. "I'm getting you some air before somebody else tries to say something clever to your face." Outside, the summer night had gone soft and warm, crickets going in the hedges, the noise of the ballroom muffled down to a low golden hum behind them. Nathaniel breathed out long and slow, like a man who'd been holding his breath for hours. "You made a mess of your own life tonight," he said. "You understand that, don't you? Whatever you had going with Hale, that's finished now. His family won't forgive a thing like this." "Good," Eleanor said. "I never wanted it to begin with." "Your mother's going to make your life a misery. She already does that," Eleanor said, and something in the flatness of it made Nathaniel look up at her properly, really look the way he hadn't allowed himself to since she'd first crossed that ballroom floor. "Why'd you do it?" he said again. Softer this time. Not a demand. Almost a plea. "Truly. Not the speech you gave Hale. The real reason." Eleanor was quiet a moment, looking out at the dark garden, the shapes of hedges cut sharp against a sky gone violet at the edges. "I watched you sit in that corner for an hour," she said, "and I watched every single person in that room walk a wide circle around your chair like you were something catching. Like whatever happened to you might happen to them if they got too close. And I thought about my whole life, Mr. Ashford every dinner, where I said the wrong thing every dance, where I stood too tall or laughed too loud or asked a question nobody wanted asked, and I remembered exactly what it feels like to watch a room decide you before you've said a single word." She looked back at him. "I didn't cross that floor to save you. I crossed it because I recognized you." Nathaniel didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had lost its edge entirely. "I ain't looking for a woman to fix me," he said. "Whatever this was tonight, I need you to understand that. I'm not some project for a bored society girl to take on so she can feel useful. I never said I wanted to fix you. Then what do you want? Eleanor considered the question honestly, the way she considered very little else that night, because everything else had happened too fast for thinking. I don't rightly know yet, she admitted. I only know I couldn't sit still and watch it happen. The rest of it, I haven't worked out. Well, Nathaniel said. And for the first time that night, something that might have been the ghost of a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. That makes two of us. Edmund Whitmore was waiting in the front hall when Eleanor finally returned home past midnight, still in her ball gown, her mother trailing behind her with a face like a thundercloud that hadn't yet broken. Sit down, he said. Not unkind exactly. Edmund Whitmore rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. 30 years of running the family's shipping trade had taught him that quiet men got obeyed faster than loud ones. Eleanor sat. Your mother tells me you danced with the Ashford boy tonight, he said. In front of Cornelius Hale. Yes, sir. And that you as good as told Cornelius Hale in front of half this town that you had no interest in marrying him. I don't recall saying that exactly, but I imagine that's the impression I gave, yes. Edmund studied her for a long moment. He had a way of looking at a person that made you feel like he was doing sums behind his eyes, weighing profit against loss, and Eleanor had spent 24 years being one of the figures in that ledger. Do you have any notion what this family has invested in that match? He said finally. Not money. I don't speak of money. I speak of years, Eleanor. Years of careful friendship with the Hale family. Years of building the kind of trust that lets two shipping fortunes marry each other without either side feeling cheated. I understand it was important to you, sir. It was important to this whole family. Your brother's futures depend on the Hale trading routes as much as your marriage does. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, and for just a moment, Eleanor saw something under the calm, real worry, real fear, the kind a man doesn't show easily. I have debts, Eleanor. Debts you know nothing about, that your mother knows nothing about. The Hale marriage was going to settle a great deal more than your future. Eleanor felt something cold drop through her chest. What debts? That is not your concern. If my marriage was meant to settle them, Father, I think it very much is my concern. Edmund's jaw tightened. It was a considerable sum, borrowed against next season's shipments. Cornelius's father agreed to extend the debt quietly as a courtesy to a future son-in-law's family. That courtesy does not survive what happened tonight. The room went very still. Margaret, standing by the door, made a small strangled sound, like she was hearing this news for the first time too. Edmund, she said, you never told me. I am telling you now, he said, not looking at her, still watching Eleanor. Because your daughter needs to understand precisely what her display at that ball has cost this family. Not embarrassment, Eleanor. Ruin. If Hale calls in that debt, we lose the warehouses. We lose the ships. We lose everything your grandfather built. Eleanor sat frozen, the weight of it settling slow and heavy over her like a wet coat. I didn't know, she said quietly. No, Edmund said. You didn't ask. You simply did as you pleased the way you always have, and left the rest of us to manage the consequences. Then let me manage this one, Eleanor said, straightening some old stubbornness rising up under the fear. Let me go to Cornelius myself tomorrow and speak with him plainly. You will do no such thing, Edmund said. You have done quite enough plain speaking for one evening. He stood signaling the conversation's end the way he always did, with a small definitive motion of his hand. You will stay away from the Ashford boy, entirely. Do you understand me? Whatever foolish sympathy drove you tonight, you will bury it, and you will pray that Cornelius Hale is a forgiving man, because if he is not, this family has no future left to protect. He left the room. Margaret lingered a moment, looking at her daughter with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite name, not triumph, not quite pity either. You should have asked me before you humiliated yourself for a stranger, Margaret said quietly, and followed her husband out, leaving Eleanor alone in the hall, with the candles burning low, and her whole carefully ordered future suddenly unrecognizable to her. 3 days passed before Eleanor saw Nathaniel Ashford again, and when she did, it wasn't by design. She'd gone walking along the road past the old mill, the one place her mother still permitted her to go unescorted, because it was considered too dull and too far for any respectable scandal to occur there. And she found him on the porch of the small caretaker's cottage near the mill pond, a book open in his lap that he wasn't reading, staring instead at the water. "Mr. Ashford." He looked up startled, and something guarded came down over his face immediately like a shutter closing. "Miss Whitmore, didn't expect to see you out this way." "I didn't expect to see you either. I thought you lived up at the manor." "I do, but I get tired of the walls sometimes. Ordered my man to bring me down here of a morning when the weather's fine." He closed the book, set it aside. "You oughtn't be seen talking to me. Not after what your family's said, I'd wager." "How do you know what my family's said?" "Because news travels faster than shame in this town, and both of them travel plenty fast." He watched her carefully. "Your father forbid you from coming near me, didn't he?" Eleanor didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. "Then you'd best turn around and walk home." Nathaniel said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that surprised her. "I already cost you a husband. I won't be the reason you lose your family too." "You didn't cost me anything. I made my own choice." "Your choice is costing your father his warehouses, from what I hear." His voice had an edge now. "Word travels like I said. I know about the debt. I know Hale's father's been making noise about calling it in early. You think I want that hanging over your head because you felt sorry for a man in a chair? I didn't feel sorry for you," Eleanor said, sharper than she meant to. "I have told you that once already." "Then why come find me again after everything it's already cost you?" "I didn't come to find you. I came to walk." "You always walk this road at this hour." She hesitated. He watched the hesitation land, and something in his face went softer, though his voice stayed hard. "Go home, Eleanor," he said, using her Christian name for the first time, and it startled her how much weight it carried coming from him. "Not because I don't want you here, because I've watched what happens to people who stand too close to me. My own cousin barely writes anymore. Half my old friends cross the street. You don't want that life. Nobody sane wants that life." "Maybe I'm not entirely sane," Eleanor said. "Maybe you ought to be more careful who you say that to," he said. But there was something almost like a smile buried under it now. "Your father find out you're here, there won't be a warehouse left standing by winter." "Then I suppose we'd best not get caught," Eleanor said, and sat down on the porch step, a few feet away from his chair, close enough to talk, far enough to be proper. And Nathaniel Ashford looked at her like a man who had forgotten somewhere in the last 8 months that anyone could still surprise him. They talked for the better part of an hour. Not about the ball, not about her father's debts, or his ruined leg, or the wreck of a carriage that had taken the use of them from him, about small things. The kind of things Eleanor hadn't realized she missed talking about until she was doing it. He asked her what she read. She asked him about the schoolhouses Cornelius had sneered at, the ones he'd built, and never claimed credit for, and watched his face change when he talked about them, something coming alive in it that she hadn't seen in the ballroom. "You built 4 of them," she said. "Why never put your name on any?" "Didn't seem like the point," he said. "Point was the children learning their letters, not some plaque with Ashford carved into it. Most men in this town would have wanted the plaque." "Most men in this town," Nathaniel said, "haven't spent 8 months finding out how little all their plaques were worth once they couldn't walk into a room to admire them." The bitterness in it caught her off guard. She didn't reach for his hand or say something soft and useless the way she suspected everyone else did around him. She just sat with it. Let it be true in the space between them, and after a moment he seemed to notice that she hadn't flinched from it, hadn't rushed to comfort him or contradict him, and something in his shoulders came down an inch. "You're the first person," he said slowly, "who's let me say a thing like that without trying to talk me out of feeling it." "Would it do any good trying to talk you out of it?" "No," he admitted. "But most folks try anyway. Makes them feel better. I reckon more than it ever helps me." "Then I won't try," Eleanor said. "I'll just sit here instead. And she did, until the light started slanting long and gold through the trees, and she knew she'd be missed at home, and she stood to go, and Nathaniel caught her wrist gently, just for a moment, just long enough to stop her. "Eleanor," he said, "whatever this is, whatever you're doing coming out here sitting on porch steps with a broken man, your family's forbidden you to see. You understand it can't end well. Not for you. I've got nothing to offer a woman like you. No legs to stand at an altar, on no name that ain't half ruined already, and now your family's fortune tangled up in the mess of it besides." "I never asked what you had to offer," Eleanor said. "Maybe you ought to start asking," he said, and let go of her wrist, and watched her walk back up the road toward home with something unreadable and aching in his face. Something he wasn't yet ready to put a name to, though it had already, without his permission, started to feel a great deal like hope. Dull. She hadn't gone half a mile before a rider came up hard behind her on the road, and she turned to find Cornelius Hale reining in beside her, his horse blowing hard like he'd ridden it fast and far to catch her. "Out walking alone, Eleanor?" he said, and there was nothing warm in it. "Or did I just see you coming from the direction of the old mill?" Her stomach dropped, but she kept her face still. "I walk that road most afternoons, as you well know." "Funny," Cornelius said. "I hear the Ashford boys taken to sitting at the mill cottage most afternoons, too. Small world, Boston. I don't see what business it is of yours where I walk." "It's very much my business," he said, swinging down off his horse, standing close enough now that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes, "given that my father is presently deciding whether to ruin yours. And given that every time you're seen anywhere near that cripple, it makes it a good deal harder for me to convince him toward mercy." "Then don't try to convince him toward anything on my account," Eleanor said. "I never asked you to be merciful." Something shifted in Cornelius's face, the calculation again sharper, now uglier. "You truly don't understand what you've started, do you?" he said, almost wondering. "You think this is about a dance, about wounded pride. It isn't. There are men in this town who have wanted Ashford land for a long while, Eleanor, and a man who can't walk to defend his own boundary lines makes for very convenient neighbors." He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes at all. "You've made yourself a witness to something you don't understand yet. I'd think carefully if I were you about how much closer you want to get to Nathaniel Ashford for his sake, if not your own." He mounted back up before she could ask him what he meant, and rode off toward town, and Eleanor stood alone on the darkening road, with his words coiling cold and slow through her chest, understanding for the first time that whatever had happened to Nathaniel's legs 8 months ago might not have been the simple accident everyone in Boston believed it to be, and that by choosing to see him, truly see him in front of the whole world, she had planted herself directly in the path of something far larger and far more dangerous than a broken engagement. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark, turning Cornelius's words over and over. "You've made yourself a witness to something you don't understand yet," until they'd worn a groove in her mind deep enough that by morning she'd stopped trying to talk herself out of what they meant. She found her father in his study, before breakfast, hunched over a ledger with a candle burned down to nothing beside him, like he hadn't slept either. "Father," Edmund didn't look up. "I told you to stay away from that road. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honest." Something in her voice made him set down his pen. "What happened to Nathaniel Ashford's carriage?" she said. "The night of his accident. Do you know?" Edmund's face did something complicated, a flicker gone fast, but she'd watched her father's face across a dinner table her whole life, and she knew every one of its tells. This one was fear. "An axle broke," he said, "on the turn above Miller's Creek. Everyone knows that." "Everyone says that," Eleanor said. "I'm asking if you know it's true." "Eleanor." "Cornelius told me yesterday that men in this town want Ashford land. He told me a man who can't walk his own boundary lines makes convenient neighbors." "Father, look at me. What did he mean by that?" Edmund's hands folded on the ledger went very still. "Cornelius Hale talks a great deal to frighten people into behaving. That's all that was." "Then why won't you look at me when you say it? He looked at her then, and whatever was in his eyes wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to pleading. Because I have debts to that family. And because a man with debts learns to keep his questions to himself. And because I am asking you, begging you, if that's what it takes to do the same. Whatever happened on that road, it is not your fight and it is not mine either, not anymore. It became my fight the moment I took his hand. Eleanor said. Then you were a fool to take it, Edmund said, and the words landed harder than he seemed to intend because his voice cracked on the last of them, and Eleanor understood, watching her father's hands tremble faintly against the ledger, that he was more frightened than angry, and that frightened men in debt did not protect their daughters. They protected the debt. She left the study without another word. She went to the mill road anyway. Nathaniel was already outside when she arrived. His chair turned toward the water, and he heard her boots on the path before she'd said a word. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning around. "Not after your father forbid it." "He didn't forbid it again this morning. He begged me instead." That got his attention. He turned the chair, studying her face, and whatever he saw there made the easy half-smile he'd been wearing fall clean away. "What happened?" "Cornelius came after me on the road yesterday. After I left you." She sat down on the step close enough to talk low. "He said men in this town want your land, Nathaniel. He said a man who can't defend his own boundaries makes for convenient neighbors. He as good as told me your accident wasn't an accident at all." The silence that followed went on long enough that a bird somewhere in the mill eaves finished an entire song before Nathaniel spoke again. "I always wondered," he said quiet, "why the axle broke clean in two on a road I'd ridden 1,000 times sober and 100 times drunk and never once had trouble on. I told myself it was bad luck, bad wood. I told myself that because the alternative was worse." "What's the alternative?" "That somebody wanted me in this chair," he said, "or wanted me dead and settled for the chair when the dead part didn't take." Eleanor felt something cold settle low in her stomach. "Who would do that? I got 200 acres of the best river frontage between here and the Connecticut line," Nathaniel said. "And no wife, no children, and until 8 months ago, no reason on God's earth to ever sell it. A man in a chair, though a man everybody in town already half believes is finished. That's a man folks start circling, waiting on him to give up, waiting on him to sell cheap just to be rid of the burden of it." "Cornelius's family," Eleanor said slowly. "Do they want riverland?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Hale Shipping's been trying to buy access to that stretch of river for 6 years. My father turned him down twice before he passed. I turned him down once myself before the accident." He looked at her, and something raw moved behind his eyes. "Third time, I never got the chance to say no. Man came to see me 2 months after I woke up in that chair, sat right where you're sitting now, and told me real gentle-like that a man in my condition ought to consider what a fair price might mean for his comfort going forward. I told him to get off my land." "Who was the man?" "Josiah Hale," Nathaniel said. "Cornelius's father." Eleanor's breath went thin. Then Cornelius knew. When he came after me on that road yesterday, he wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what he was warning me off of. "Seems that way," Nathaniel said, and reached out, not for her hand this time, but to grip the arm of his chair like he needed something solid under his fingers. "Which means you need to go home, Eleanor. And you need to stay there, because if that family's willing to break a man's legs for Riverland, I don't imagine they'll think twice about what they'd do to a woman who started asking the wrong questions." "I'm not going home." "Eleanor, you just told me somebody may have crippled you on purpose, and you expect me to go home and drink tea about it." Her voice had gone sharp, urgent. "No, I want to know who was driving that carriage the night it broke. I want to know if anyone saw anything on that road." Nathaniel was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, something had shifted in his voice. Not resistance anymore, but a kind of careful, frightened hope. The sound of a man who'd stopped believing anyone would ever ask these questions alongside him. "There's a man," he said slowly, "Amos Beecher, works the Hale stables. He was out on that road the same night hauling feed up to the Hale barn. If anybody saw that axle before it broke, If anybody saw a wheel tampered with or a man crouched by my carriage in the dark, it'd be Amos. Has anyone asked him? Nobody's had reason to ask him anything. Whole town decided the story the same night it happened. Broken axle, bad luck, God's will. He looked at her. You go asking Amos Beecher questions, and word gets back to Josiah Hale that you're asking them. That's a fire neither one of us can put out. Then I'll be careful, Eleanor said. Careful ain't a word that means much once the Hales decide you're a problem. I'm already a problem, Eleanor said. I've been a problem since the day I was born, according to my mother. I intend to make good use of it. She found Amos Beecher 3 days later, not by riding straight up to the Hale stables like a fool, but by waiting at the Crossroads Chapel on a Sunday morning, where every soul in the county came sooner or later, servant and gentry alike, and where a quiet word could pass between two people standing close in a crowd without anyone marking it strange. Amos was a broad, sun-worn man of maybe 50 hat. In his hand, standing near the back, the way working men did, careful not to take up space, meant for their betters. Eleanor came and stood beside him, under the pretense of admiring the church bell, and spoke low without looking at him. Mr. Beecher, I need to ask you something about the night Nathaniel Ashford's carriage went off the road above Miller's Creek. Amos went very still. Don't know nothing about that, miss. You were on that road that night hauling feed. Wasn't me. His voice had gone tight-clipped, a man closing a door fast. Mr. Beecher, please. He might have died. Somebody may have made certain of it, and I think you know something. Amos finally turned his head just enough to look at her sideways, and what she saw in his face wasn't refusal anymore. It was fear, plain and raw, the kind that lived behind a man's eyes for a long time after whatever put it there. You don't want to be asking me these things, miss, he said, barely above a whisper. Not here. Not anywhere folks can see us talking. Then when... I got a wife, Amos said. I got 4 children. I got a job that feeds them, and a roof the Hale family owns the deed to. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand you're frightened. I'm not frightened, Amos said too fast, and then quieter, honest in a way that undid the lie the moment after he'd said it. I'm frightened enough that I ain't slept a full night in 8 months, miss, ever since I seen what I seen. Eleanor's heart slammed once hard. What did you see? Amos's eyes darted toward the front of the chapel, toward the Hale family pew, empty for now, but not for long, and he shook his head once sharp. Not here, he said. Mill Pond. Sunday after next, an hour past dark, when my wife thinks I'm at cards with the other men. I'll tell you what I know, but you tell no living soul I met you, and you don't breathe my name to Ashford, nor anybody else till I've said my piece. He walked away before she could answer, and Eleanor stood alone by the bell tower with her hands shaking, understanding that she had just bought herself a full week and a half of waiting on a truth that might unravel everything, and that somewhere between now and then, she would have to find a way to keep herself and Nathaniel and Amos Beecher all safely out of the path of a family that had already proven what it was willing to do to protect a piece of riverland. The waiting nearly undid her. She went back to the mill road twice that week, and both times found small, quiet reasons to be near Nathaniel that had nothing to do with Amos Beecher, and everything to do with the strange, steady comfort of sitting beside a man who didn't ask her to be anything other than exactly what she was. The second visit she brought bread still warm from the kitchen, wrapped in a cloth, and set it on the little table beside his chair without ceremony. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. Cook know you took it. Cook thinks I'm feeding the birds, Eleanor said, and Nathaniel laughed a real laugh, short and surprised, like it had come loose from somewhere he'd forgotten he kept it. First honest laugh I've had in longer than I care to say. He admitted breaking off a piece of the bread. Then I'll bring bread more often. You keep coming out here, your mother's going to skin you. My mother's been threatening to skin me since I was 6 years old, Eleanor said. I've built up quite a tolerance. He smiled at that, and for a while they didn't talk about Hales or debts or broken axles at all. He told her about the horse he used to keep before the accident, a big gray gelding named Solomon, that his father had bought off a Kentucky breeder, and how he used to ride the whole 200 acres before breakfast just to feel the land under him. His voice caught just slightly on "used to," and Eleanor didn't reach for his hand or say something soft to smooth it over. She just let the catch sit there, honest between them, the way she had the first time. "You ever try?" she asked carefully. "Since the accident riding, I mean. Not the way you used to. Different. Doctor says my legs might come back some with time and effort. Says a man's body can surprise you if he's willing to work at it." His jaw tightened. "I stopped trying round about the 4th month. Seemed like a fool's errand working myself half to death for legs that weren't listening anyhow." "Why'd you stop?" "Because trying and failing hurt worse than not trying at all," he said, plain and unashamed, and Eleanor felt something in her chest twist tight at the honesty of it. "What if I helped?" she said. "Not to fix you. I know better than to say a fool thing like that to you now. Just to try again, with somebody there who isn't waiting to watch you fail." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something wary and something hopeful both moving behind his eyes at once. "You'd do that," he said, not quite a question. "I've got nothing better to do most afternoons besides get scolded by my mother," Eleanor said. "Might as well make myself useful." They tried it the following afternoon, in the flat stretch of grass behind the cottage out of sight of the road. It went badly, and then it went worse, and Nathaniel's face went dark with a shame so raw Eleanor had to look away from it more than once. His legs buckling under him, the moment he tried to bear weight, his whole big frame crashing down into the grass with a sound that made her flinch. "Get away," he said the first time it happened, voice thick with fury that wasn't aimed at her at all. "Just give me a minute." "I'm not going anywhere." "I said give me a minute, Eleanor." She sat back down on the grass a few feet off, and waited, and after a long, silent stretch, Nathaniel dragged himself back up onto his elbows, breathing hard, humiliation and fury, both draining slowly out of his face and leaving something raw underneath. "This is what I didn't want you to see," he said quiet. "This part, the falling, the ugliness of it." "I've seen worse," Eleanor said. "Have you?" "I watched my brother die of the fever when I was 12. She said, steady, not flinching from it. "I held the basin while he was sick for 3 days straight, and I never once looked away because I loved him too much to spare myself the ugliness of it. Falling down in the grass, Nathaniel Ashford is not going to send me running." Something in his face broke open then, just slightly, just enough. He let her help him back into the chair, and neither of them spoke of it again that day, but something had shifted between them, quiet and permanent, the particular intimacy of having been seen at your worst and not abandoned for it. Again, the Sunday of Amos Beecher's promised meeting arrived cold with waiting. Eleanor told her mother she'd gone to bed early with a headache, climbed out through the side garden the way she'd done exactly once before in her life years ago chasing fireflies as a girl, and walked the mile to the mill pond in the dark with her heart going like a drum the whole way. Amos was already there when she arrived, pacing hat crushed in his hands. "You came alone," he said, surprised. "I told no one. Same as you asked." He nodded, some of the tension easing out of his shoulders, and then he started talking fast and low, like a man who'd been holding the words in so long. They came out in a flood once the dam finally broke. "I was hauling feed up past Miller's Creek that night," he said. "Late past 10 on account of the wagon axle giving me trouble earlier that day, which I remember thinking was ironic later considering. I seen Mr. Ashford's carriage coming down the far bend moving quick the way he always drove, and I seen a man crouched down by the roadside not 50 yards ahead of him, right where the road narrows above the creek bank. What was he doing? Didn't think nothing of it at first, figured a man fixing his boot maybe or relieving himself in the bushes. But the carriage came round that bend, and I heard it a crack sharp like a gunshot almost, and then the whole carriage went sideways and off the road and down toward the creek, and I heard Mr. Ashford scream." Amos's voice shook. "I ran toward it. Man who'd been crouched by the road, he was gone by the time I got there. Vanished into the trees like he'd never been standing there at all. Did you see his face? Didn't get close enough. Dark night, no moon to speak of." Amos swallowed hard. But I found something the next morning, miss, going back to that spot in daylight, looking for my dropped feed sack. Found a wheel wedge, the kind you use to prop a wagon axle, while you work under it, laying in the ditch not 10 feet from where that man had been crouched. Wasn't Ashford's. His was still fixed under the wreck, splintered clean through. This one was a spare tossed aside like somebody'd finished with it, and didn't care to be found holding it. Do you still have it? Amos hesitated, and in that hesitation, Eleanor felt the whole night tilt sideways. I did, he said. Kept it hid in my barn 8 months, scared to show a soul, scared of what it had cost me if the wrong person found out I had it. He looked at her, and his eyes had gone hollow. 3 days ago, somebody broke into my barn in the night. Took nothing but that wedge, miss. Nothing else touched. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. Eleanor's blood went cold. Someone knows you have proof. Someone knew before I ever told you a word of this, Amos said, and his hands were shaking now, plain to see even in the dark. Which means somebody's been watching me a good deal longer than I realized, and I got to ask you plain, miss, who else did you tell you were coming here tonight? No one, Eleanor said. I swear it. A twig snapped somewhere in the trees behind them, and both of them went rigid. Who's there? Amos called out, voice cracking. No answer came. Only the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps retreating through the brush, unhurried, almost mocking in how little effort they made to stay hidden, as if whoever it was wanted them to know they'd been heard. Amos grabbed Eleanor's arm. Go home, now. Don't look back. Don't run. Just walk steady, like you got nothing to hide, and you get behind your own front door before you breathe easy. What about you? I'll manage, he said, though his face said otherwise. Go, miss, please. Eleanor walked the mile home faster than she'd ever walked anything in her life. Every shadow along the road suddenly alive with menace. And she didn't breathe easy until she'd climbed back through the garden and shut her bedroom door behind her and pressed her back against it, heart slamming, understanding with total terrifying clarity that whatever she had started the night, she knelt down in front of Nathaniel Ashford's chair, had grown into something with teeth. She didn't sleep. At first light, she was back on the mill road, half running, desperate to tell Nathaniel everything before her nerve broke. She found him already outside, and one look at his face told her something had happened in the night that had nothing to do with what she'd come to say. Amos Beecher's dead, he said, before she could get a word out. The ground seemed to tilt under her. What? Found this morning drowned in the mill pond, not far from where you two met last night. If what you're about to tell me is what I think you're about to tell me. His voice was tight controlled in the particular way of a man holding fury down by main force. Whole town's already calling it an accident. Man had too much to drink at cards, wandered off the path in the dark, fell in. He wasn't at cards, Eleanor whispered. He was with me. I know, Nathaniel said. Which means somebody followed you both, and somebody made certain Amos Beecher never told anyone else what you two talked about last night. And Eleanor, his voice cracked. Real fear breaking through the control for the first time since she'd known him. You were standing right beside him when it happened. If that man had wanted to, he could have taken you too. Eleanor felt her legs go weak, and she sat down hard on the porch step, the wedge the wheel. Amos's shaking hands, all of it crashing over her at once alongside the horror of what he hadn't lived to see morning after. He told me everything, she said. Before whatever happened. He saw a man crouched by your carriage the night of the accident. He found a wheel wedge in the ditch the next morning and kept it hidden 8 months. 3 nights ago, somebody broke into his barn and stole it. And now he's dead. Nathaniel's hands had curled into fists against the arms of his chair, knuckles white. Then whoever did this to me 8 months ago just did it again, and this time they didn't bother making it look gentle. We have to go to the sheriff. With what? Nathaniel said, bitter. A dead man's word that only you heard, that only you can repeat. A missing wedge, nobody but you, and a corpse ever laid eyes on Josiah Hales. Got half this county's sheriffs and magistrates eating off his family's table one way or another. Eleanor. You walk into that office with this story, you're not bringing justice down on his head. You're painting a target on your own. Then what do we do? Just let Amos Beecher's murder go answered for as some drunk man's accident? No, Nathaniel said, and something hard and old settled into his voice. The ghost of the man he must have been before the accident, before 8 months of shrinking into a corner chair. But we do it careful. We find another way to prove it something that can't just be dismissed as one frightened girl's word against a dead stableman's. And until we do, you don't go near that mill pond again, you don't ask another soul another question, and you sure as hell don't tell your father one word of what you just told me, because if Josiah Hale so much as suspects, you know what you know. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Eleanor sat on that porch step in the gray early light with the memory of Amos Beecher's shaking hands still vivid in her mind, and understood that the danger circling Nathaniel Ashford had stopped being a rumor, whispered on a dark road, and had become in the space of one terrible night, something that could reach out and take a life without so much as a ripple of consequence, and that she was now standing directly inside its reach. The funeral for Amos Beecher was small quiet over in 20 minutes, and Eleanor stood at the back of the churchyard, where nobody would mark her presence too closely, watching his widow clutch 4 children close to her skirts, and understanding that she was looking at the cost of a truth nobody yet had proof of. Josiah Hale attended. Of course he attended. He stood near the front in his good black coat hat over his heart, and when the brief service ended, he was the first to press money into the widow's hand, loud enough for half the churchyard to hear him do it. "Terrible accident," he said, shaking his head with an expression of grave sorrow that made Eleanor's stomach turn. "A man like Amos gone too soon. This family will see his wife and children provided for. You have my word." Eleanor watched him work. The crowd watched the way people nodded gratefully at his generosity, watched Cornelius standing a few paces behind his father with a face carved out of stone, and she thought of a dead man's shaking hands in the dark, and a wheel wedge stolen from a locked barn, and she had to dig her nails into her own palm to keep her face from showing what she knew. Cornelius found her afterward near the churchyard gate, and something in his eyes had changed since the ballroom colder, now more careful. "You look pale, Eleanor," he said. "I've had a difficult week." "So I've heard." He glanced past her toward the fresh grave, then back. "Terrible thing about Beecher. Drink does strange things to a man's footing in the dark." "He wasn't drinking that night," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. Cornelius went very still. "How would you know that?" She'd made a mistake, and she knew it the instant the words left her mouth, watched it land in his face and settle there. Watched him recalculate her all over again, the way he had in the ballroom, and this time there was nothing soft in it at all. "I only meant," she said carefully, "that a man doesn't usually drown in 3 feet of water so close to shore, drunk or sober." "No," Cornelius agreed slowly. "He doesn't." He studied her a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped low enough that only she could hear it. "I'd think very hard, Eleanor, about what roads you walk after dark from now on. This county isn't as safe as it used to be. Man could get hurt poking around in matters that don't concern him." He walked away before she could answer, and Eleanor stood at the churchyard gate, with her heart hammering, certain now beyond any doubt that Cornelius Hale knew a great deal more than an innocent son ought to know about his father's business. She told Nathaniel everything that evening out at the mill cottage, her voice shaking through the retelling of Cornelius's warning. "He as good as confirmed it," she said. "Nathaniel, he knew Amos didn't drown by accident. A man doesn't say a thing like that unless he already knows the truth of it." Nathaniel's face had gone hard and still, the particular stillness of a man forcing himself not to move, not to react, because reacting cost him more than it cost most people. Every flash of anger in him had nowhere to go, no legs to carry him toward a fight, no fists that could do anything but curl uselessly in his lap. "I want you to stop," he said finally. "Stop what?" "All of it. The questions, the walking out here, whatever this has become between us." His voice was rough. "Amos Beecher is dead because he talked to you, Eleanor. I will not have you be next." "You think stopping now protects me?" Eleanor's voice rose sharp with fear, turned to anger, the way it so often went in her. Cornelius already suspects what I know. Stopping doesn't undo that. It just means Amos died for nothing. Better that than you dying for something, Nathaniel said, and the rawness in it silenced her a moment. I have already lost the use of my legs to this family's greed. I will not sit in this chair and watch them take you too. Do you understand me? Go home. Marry someone your father approves of. Forget you ever knelt down in that ballroom. Is that truly what you want? The question hung there, and Nathaniel didn't answer it right away. And in the silence, Eleanor saw the truth plainer than any words could have given it. His jaw working, his hands gripping the chair's arms, a man fighting his own heart with everything he had left because he believed loving her was the same as endangering her. What I want, he said finally low, has stopped mattering the moment it became more dangerous for you than for me. Let me decide what's too dangerous for me, Eleanor said. I have spent 24 years letting other people decide that. My mother decided what dresses were proper. My father decided who I'd marry. I will not let you decide this too. Nathaniel Ashford. Not even out of love. The word hung in the air between them, unplanned, escaped before either of them could stop it, and Nathaniel looked up at her like she'd struck him. You don't mean that, he said, but it wasn't really a denial. It was a man asking permission to believe something he'd been forbidding himself to believe for weeks. I mean it, Eleanor said, quiet. Now all the fight gone out of her voice, and something more frightening and more honest left in its place. I don't know when it happened. Somewhere between the ballroom and the bread, and watching you fall in that grass and get back up anyway. But I mean it. Nathaniel reached for her hand, and this time there was nothing careful or hesitant in it. Then God help us both, he said. Because I love you too, and I don't know how to keep you safe and keep loving you at the same time. Maybe you don't have to choose, Eleanor said. Maybe we find the proof and we end this together instead of you trying to send me away to keep me safe from a danger that's going to find me whether I'm standing beside you or hiding at home. The letter arrived 4 days later, slipped under the Whitmore's side door sometime in the night, addressed to Eleanor in handwriting she didn't recognize, no signature at the bottom. Miss Whitmore, my husband knew things he shouldn't have. He told me some of it before he died. Meet me at the fabric shop on Tremont Street Thursday. Ask for blue thread. I'll know who you are. Eleanor's hands shook reading it. Amos's widow. Reaching out from her own grief and terror to finish what her husband had started. She went alone, telling her mother she needed thread for mending, and found a thin, hollow-eyed woman waiting near the back of the shop, a baby on her hip, 2 more children clinging to her skirts. You're the one my Amos talked to, the woman said, not a question. I am. I'm so sorry for your loss. Don't be sorry. Be careful. The woman's voice shook, but her eyes were steady, fierce, with a grief that had curdled into something harder. Amos came home shaking the night before he died. Told me he'd talked to a Whitmore girl about the Ashford accident. Told me he was scared, said he thought somebody'd been following him for days already, ever since that wedge went missing from the barn. Did he tell you anything else? Anything about who might have taken it, or who he thought was involved? The woman glanced around the shop, lowered her voice further. He said Josiah Hale come to see him personal week before he died. Real friendly like. Asked after his family, asked how the children were faring, asked did he need anything new. Roof maybe before winter came on. Amos said it didn't feel like kindness. Said it felt like a man reminding him what he had to lose. That's not proof, Eleanor said, frustration and fear tangling together in her chest. That's a threat dressed up as charity. It wouldn't hold in front of a magistrate. No, the woman agreed. But this might. She reached into the folds of her shawl and drew out something small wrapped in cloth and pressed it into Eleanor's hands before she could think better of it. Amos hid a second wedge, twin to the one that went missing. Found it same morning as the first half buried in the ditch mud. Didn't think much of it till after the first one got stolen. Then he understood there'd been 2 likely one for each side of the axle, and whoever did the tampering left one behind by mistake in the dark. He never told a soul he had this one. Buried it under the henhouse the very night his first one disappeared, Said if anything ever happened to him, I was to give it only to you. Eleanor unwrapped the cloth with trembling hands. A wedge of dark wood splintered at one end, stained faintly with something that might have been old grease, might have been something else. It looked on its own like nothing at all. But it was proof that two wedges had existed, that whoever tampered with Nathaniel's carriage had used tools, had planned it, had not left the work of destruction to chance or bad luck. "This is real," Eleanor breathed. "It's the only thing I have left of what my husband died knowing." The woman said, her composure cracking, at last tears rising fast and fierce. "You use it right, Miss Whitmore. You make his death mean something. Or so help me God, I will never forgive either one of us for letting him talk to you in the first place." She brought the wedge to Nathaniel that evening and watched him turn it over and over in his hands, like it might tell him something more if he studied it long enough. "This isn't enough on its own," he said finally. "A piece of wood, even a suspicious one, doesn't prove Josiah Hale's hand touched it. We need someone who saw him near my carriage that night, or someone willing to swear under oath what he told Amos." "Cornelius knows something," Eleanor said. "I'm certain of it. The way he spoke at the churchyard, he wasn't guessing at Amos's death. He knew." "Knowing and confessing are different animals," Nathaniel said. "Cornelius Hale isn't going to walk into a magistrate's office and hand his own father a noose. Not willingly." Eleanor agreed slowly, an idea forming dangerous and half-shaped. But what if he thought his father had already betrayed him first? Nathaniel looked up sharply. "What are you thinking?" "Cornelius wants me," Eleanor said, "or wanted me before the ballroom before all of this. His pride is wounded, not his heart, I think, but pride can be a useful thing to work with. What if I went to him, told him I knew things about his father, hinted I had proof, watched how he reacted. A guilty man protects his father's secret. But a man who feels used by his own family, a man who's been kept in the dark and doesn't like discovering it. That's a dangerous game, Eleanor. You'd be walking straight into the lion's den telling a Hale you know something you shouldn't." "I'm already in the lion's den," Eleanor said. "I have been since the night I knelt down in that ballroom. At least this way I choose the ground I stand on." Nathaniel was quiet a long moment, jaw working, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a fear he didn't bother hiding. "If anything happens to you," he said, "I want you to understand something. I have already lost the use of my legs. I have already lost my name in half this town's mouths. I do not know what a man like me does with a loss like losing you, Eleanor Whitmore. But I know it would finish whatever's left of me a good deal more thoroughly than any broken axle ever could." "Then trust me to come back," Eleanor said, and kissed him soft and sure, the first time either of them had allowed themselves that particular honesty, and for one suspended moment, neither the Hales, nor the wedge, nor the whole dangerous tangle of it existed at all. Only the two of them, and the fragile, fierce thing growing steady between them despite every reason it shouldn't have survived this long. She found Cornelius 3 days later at his family's stable yard, timed carefully for an hour. She knew his father would be in Boston on shipping business. "Eleanor." He looked surprised, and beneath the surprise something wary. "This is unexpected. I need to speak with you, alone." He studied her a moment, then waved off the stable boy hovering nearby, and led her a short distance off, out of easy earshot. "If this is about the ballroom, it isn't." Eleanor kept her voice steady, though her heart was slamming. "It's about your father and a wheel wedge and a man named Amos Beecher who is dead because he saw something he shouldn't have." Cornelius went very still, all the wariness sharpening into something colder. "I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. I think you knew before Amos ever drowned that your father had something to do with Nathaniel's accident. I think that's why you warned me off the mill road so carefully not to protect your family's reputation, but because you already knew exactly what your family was capable of." "Careful," Cornelius said, low and dangerous. "You're accusing my father of attempted murder, Eleanor. Words like that get people hurt." "They already have," Eleanor said. "Amos Beecher is dead, and I have to wonder," Cornelius, did your father tell you before or after? Did he sit you down and explain that a rival's crippling was simply good business, the way he explains shipping routes and trade tariffs? Or did you find out the same way I did, piece by piece, too late to stop any of it, and now stuck deciding whether loyalty to your father is worth the blood on his hands? Something cracked behind Cornelius's eyes. Not confession, not yet, but the particular flinch of a man hearing a private fear spoken aloud by someone else. You don't know anything, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. I know there were 2 wedges, Eleanor said quietly. I know Amos found the second one the morning after the accident and hid it before anyone knew he had it. I know your father visited him a week before he died, offering charity that felt like a threat. And I know that if I take what I know to a magistrate in Boston, not here, not somewhere your father's influence reaches easy, this family's name will not survive what comes after. You're bluffing. Try me, Eleanor said, and held his gaze and watched him search her face for the lie he desperately wanted to find there, and failed to find it because there wasn't one. Cornelius turned away from her, pacing a few steps, his hands raking through his hair, and when he turned back, his face had changed entirely, the cold calculation gone, something rawer and younger underneath it. I didn't know, he said, quiet, almost desperate. Not at first. I suspected, God help me, the way a son suspects things about a father he doesn't want to look at too closely. But I didn't know for certain until 3 nights ago. Eleanor's breath caught. What happened 3 nights ago? I found the first wedge, Cornelius said. The one stolen from Beecher's barn. In my father's study, locked in his desk, along with a letter from a man named Silas Corbin. Hired muscle works out of the Port District, does jobs nobody asks too many questions about. The letter confirmed payment received for services rendered regarding the Ashford matter. His voice cracked on the last words. My own father. I've spent 8 months watching Nathaniel Ashford rot in that chair, hearing the whole town whisper about his ruin, and the whole time it was my father's hand that put him there. Will you testify to what you found and destroy my own family? Cornelius's laugh came out broken bitter. You don't understand what you're asking. My mother would never survive the shame of it. My sisters would never make decent matches again. Everything my father built, everything our name stands for in this county, gone in the space of one confession. Nathaniel lost the use of his legs, Eleanor said, quiet but unrelenting. Amos Beecher lost his life. Your family's shame is a heavy price, Cornelius, but it is not the heaviest one that's already been paid here. Cornelius stood silent a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone hollow and resigned. There's a gathering, he said. End of the month. Spring festival, half the county attending, my father hosting it himself at our house to smooth over whatever talk's been circulating since the ballroom. He means to announce a new match for me publicly, put the whole scandal to bed. If I were to bring the wedge and the letter and stand up in front of every important family in this county and say what I found, you'd be believed, Eleanor said. A son testifying against his own father carries a weight no outsider's word ever could. I'd also be destroyed, Cornelius said. But I suppose I've been walking around half destroyed since I found that letter anyway. Might as well let it mean something. Kia. The festival arrived on a warm evening, thick with the smell of cut grass and late lilacs. The Hale family's grounds, strung with lanterns, half of Boston's finest, gathered under a sky just beginning to purple at its edges. Eleanor arrived with her parents, her mother still barely speaking to her, her father's face gray and drawn with a worry that had nothing to do with scandal anymore, and everything to do with debts he still hadn't found a way to escape. Nathaniel arrived separately, wheeled in by his own manservant, and the murmur that followed him through the crowd was different this time, less mocking, more uncertain, the particular murmur of people who'd heard rumors they didn't yet know how to arrange into a story. Eleanor found him near the edge of the gathering. Cornelius is here. He has the wedge. He has the letter. Then God help us both, Nathaniel said, because there's no turning back from tonight. Josiah Hale took the small raised platform near the musicians an hour into the evening, all warm smiles and easy authority, raising a glass to toast his son's upcoming match. Some other family's daughter announced with great ceremony, the crowd applauding politely. "And now," Josiah said, beaming, "let us put the season's small unpleasantness behind us and dance the night away as good neighbors ought. Father." Cornelius's voice cut across the lawn, steady, despite the tremor Eleanor could see in his hands even from 20 feet away. "Before we dance, I have something that needs saying." The crowd's murmur shifted, curious now. Josiah's smile flickered just slightly. "Cornelius, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Cornelius said, and climbed up beside his father on the small platform, and drew the wedge from inside his coat, holding it up for the gathered crowd to see. "Does anyone here recognize this A-wheel wedge, the kind used to prop an axle for repair? This one was found in a ditch above Miller's Creek the same night Nathaniel Ashford's carriage went off that road and left him unable to walk." A ripple of shocked whispers moved through the crowd. Josiah's face had gone very still, very white. "Cornelius," he said, low, urgent, "put that down. You don't know what you're—" "I found it in your desk, Father," Cornelius said, and his voice cracked wide open. Now grief and fury tangled together. Along with a letter from a man named Silas Corbin, confirming payment received for services rendered regarding the Ashford matter. He turned to face the crowd, fully 300 faces frozen in horrified silence. "My father paid a man to sabotage Nathaniel Ashford's carriage. My father crippled a man over a stretch of river frontage. And when a stableman named Amos Beecher found proof of it, my father made certain he never spoke of it again." The lawn erupted into chaos. Gasps, cries of disbelief, someone near the back already running for a magistrate. Margaret Whitmore's hand flying to her mouth. Edmund Whitmore going gray as ash. Josiah Hale lunged for his son, face twisted with fury. "You ungrateful, treacherous—" "Don't—" Nathaniel's voice rang out, cutting through the chaos, and heads turned toward him, toward the man in the chair who had rolled himself forward, right up to the edge of the platform alone, unafraid, 8 months of buried fury finally rising to the surface. "Don't you dare lay a hand on that boy for telling the truth. You were too much a coward to ever confess yourself." Josiah froze, staring down at Nathaniel, and something in the older man's face crumbled. Not remorse. Eleanor understood, watching close, but the particular collapse of a man who has finally run out of rooms to hide in. "You have no idea what that land was worth to this family," Josiah said, low, venomous. "No idea what I was protecting. You crippled a man," Nathaniel said, "and murdered another to keep it quiet over acreage. I hope it was worth it, Josiah, because you're about to lose every acre you own defending what you did to get it." The magistrate arrived within the hour, summoned by a dozen frantic messengers, and Eleanor stood beside Nathaniel's chair on that ruined, beautiful lawn, watching Josiah Hale led away in restraints past the very guests he'd invited to celebrate his son's engagement. The whole gathered county bearing silent, stunned witness to the unraveling of a name that had ruled this corner of Massachusetts for 3 generations, and she understood, watching Nathaniel's hand find hers and hold it fast, that whatever came next, they had finally together dragged the truth out into the light where it could not be buried again. Nobody moved for a long moment after the magistrate's men led Josiah Hale off that lawn. The lanterns kept burning. The musicians stood frozen with their instruments half raised, unsure whether a night that had shattered so completely could possibly call for another note of music. Cornelius stood alone on the platform, the wedge still clutched in one white-knuckled hand, staring after his father's retreating back like a man who'd just watched the ground open up beneath his own house and swallow it whole. Eleanor felt her own father's hand close hard around her arm. "We need to leave," Edmund said, low and urgent. "Now, Eleanor, before what?" Eleanor pulled free of his grip, gentler than she felt. "Before people see us standing near the family that just told the truth. Before people start asking what the Whitmores knew and when." Edmund said, and there was real fear in his face now, not the careful, calculated fear of a man protecting his ledgers, but something rawer. "Your name was tangled up with Cornelius Hale's for months, Eleanor. If this scandal reaches deep enough, it could pull us down with it." "Then let it," Eleanor said. I am done pretending I don't know things simply because knowing them is inconvenient. She turned back to Nathaniel before her father could argue further, and found him still staring at the empty platform. His jaw tight, his whole body rigid in that particular way she'd learned meant he was holding something enormous, very carefully in check. "It's done," she said softly. "He's gone, Nathaniel. They're taking him to Boston tonight." "It's not done," Nathaniel said. "It's only started." He looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, not triumph, though he'd earned the right to feel it, but a kind of exhausted, disbelieving relief, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long, he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it. 8 months, Eleanor. 8 months of every soul in this county deciding what happened to me, deciding I'd simply been unlucky, deciding my ruin was God's will, or bad wheelwork, or plain bad fortune. And it was a man's greed the whole time. A man sitting 3 tables down from me at church every Sunday, shaking my hand, offering his sympathies. I know. I want to hate him, Nathaniel said, voice rough. I want to hate him with everything I've got left. But mostly I just feel tired. Tired in a way I don't have words for. Eleanor knelt down beside his chair, right there on the ruined lawn, with half the county still standing in stunned clusters around them, and took both his hands in hers. Then rest, she said. Just for tonight. Let the magistrate do his work, and let your body have one evening where it doesn't have to carry anything at all. Tomorrow, there will be plenty left to fight for. Tonight, just breathe. The weeks that followed moved fast and strange, the whole shape of Boston society rearranging itself around the scandal, like water finding a new channel after a dam breaks. Josiah Hale sat in a Boston jail awaiting trial, his shipping business frozen, pending investigation, half his former associates suddenly too busy to remember his name. Cornelius, stripped of the inheritance he'd have come into, moved out of the family house entirely, taking rooms above a printer's shop in town, and Eleanor heard through her mother's endless gossip network that he'd begun actually working alongside a lawyer, preparing testimony for his father's trial. She found him once by chance in the printer's shop doorway, looking thinner than she remembered, older around the eyes. "Eleanor." He nodded, careful, uncertain of his welcome. "How are you managing?" "Poorly, if I'm honest." A tired half smile. Turns out being the son of a man on trial for maiming and murder does wonders for a fellow's social calendar. "I've had exactly 1 dinner invitation since the festival, and that was from Nathaniel Ashford himself, which I still can't quite credit." Eleanor blinked. "Nathaniel invited you to dinner. Said something about a man who tells an ugly truth about his own blood, deserving at least 1 decent meal that isn't eaten alone." Cornelius shook his head, something almost wondering in his face. "I always thought him weak, you know, before the accident. Handsome, charming, everyone's favorite, but weak, somehow too easy with people, too quick to give his time to farmers and schoolchildren instead of building something that mattered. I understand now I had the whole measure of the man backward." "Most people did," Eleanor said. "I owe him an apology I don't know how to give," Cornelius admitted. "And I owe you one too, for what it's worth. That warning I gave you on the road, I told myself I was protecting you. Truth is, some part of me already suspected what my father'd done, and I was more interested in protecting the family name than protecting you from what I half knew was coming." "You told the truth in the end," Eleanor said. "That has to count for something." "I hope so," Cornelius said, "because it's cost me everything else I had." The debt at least resolved itself faster than Eleanor had dared hope. With Hale Shipping's assets frozen pending the criminal investigation, and with Josiah's crimes laid bare in front of half the county's finest families, Edmund Whitmore found himself strangely in a position of unexpected leverage rather than ruin. No one wished to be seen calling in a debt against a family that had helped expose a murderer, and within a month, a quiet arrangement had been reached, extending the terms indefinitely. No interest, no urgency. Simply the tacit understanding that punishing the Whitmores now would look very poorly indeed. Her father told her this over breakfast, stiff and formal, in the way he always was when admitting he'd been wrong. "It seems," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "that your recklessness has done this family a service rather than a ruin." "It wasn't recklessness," Eleanor said. "It was refusing to look away. Call it what you like." He set down his coffee cup, and for a moment something almost gentle moved across his face. "Your mother thinks I ought to forbid you from seeing the Ashford boy still. Says it isn't proper given everything that's happened." Eleanor's spine went straight. "Father," I told her. Edmund continued cutting her off, that a man who forbids his daughter from a suitor, brave enough to face down Josiah Hale in front of the whole county, and steady enough to hold his tongue about it for 8 months, rather than make wild accusations, he couldn't prove as a man who doesn't deserve the daughter he's got. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with his own sentiment. "You may see him, Eleanor. With my blessing, such as it's worth." Eleanor stared at her father, something loosening in her chest that she hadn't realized had been clenched tight for weeks. "Truly. Don't make me say it twice." Edmund said gruff, already retreating back behind his newspaper, but Eleanor caught the small, unguarded softness at the corner of his mouth before he disappeared behind the print, and understood that whatever else had broken and mended in the last month, something between her and her father had shifted too quietly permanently for the better. She rode out to the mill cottage that same afternoon to tell Nathaniel and found him not in his usual spot by the pond, but out in the flat stretch of grass behind the cottage alone. His manservant nowhere in sight, gripping 2 parallel wooden rails that had been driven into the ground since her last visit. Sweat soaking through his shirt, his whole face a mask of grim, furious concentration. Nathaniel. He didn't look up, didn't break his focus, his forearms shaking with effort as he dragged one foot forward along the ground, then the other, inch by agonizing inch between the rails. "Don't," he said through gritted teeth. "Don't help me. I need to do this myself." Eleanor stood frozen, watching him, understanding suddenly that this wasn't the man who'd told her 4 weeks ago that trying and failing hurt worse than never trying at all. Something in him had cracked open the night Josiah Hale was led away in chains. Some old fury and old grief finally given somewhere honest to go. And he'd apparently been pouring all of it into this hour after hour alone, driving his ruined legs back toward some memory of what they used to do. He made it to the end of the rail, both hands white-knuckled on the wood, breathing like a man who'd run a mile, and then his legs buckled and he went down hard into the grass. And this time, instead of the fury she remembered from before he started to laugh, rough, disbelieving half-sob. 6 feet, he said when she rushed to him. "Eleanor, 6 feet. Yesterday I couldn't make 3. You've been doing this every day since the festival," he admitted, letting her help him sit up, his whole body trembling with exhaustion. "Doctor says the injury was never as complete as everyone assumed. Said the muscles atrophied from disuse and defeat more than anything the accident itself destroyed. 8 months I sat in that chair believing I was finished, and it turns out half of what was broken in me was never my legs at all." "What changed?" "You," he said simply. And watching Cornelius Hale find the courage to burn his own family down for the truth when I'd spent 8 months too ashamed to even ask the questions that led us there. I got tired of being a man other people had to be brave for. I wanted to earn back some piece of the man I used to be. Eleanor helped him back into his chair, her hands gentle now, instead of steadying, and something in the way he watched her do it. No shame in his face this time. Only a kind of fierce, grateful pride told her the ground between them had shifted as surely as the ground beneath her father's ledgers had. 6 feet today, she said. How far tomorrow? 7. If you'll come watch me try, Nathaniel said, and pulled her down for a kiss that tasted like sweat and summer grass, and something that felt for the first time since the ballroom entirely unafraid. The trial began in late June, and Eleanor sat through 3 days of testimony in a Boston courtroom packed tight with spectators watching Silas Corbin. The hired man, Cornelius's letter, had named Brake under questioning and confirm every detail of the arrangement, watching Josiah Hale's face go from defiant to gray to finally unmistakably afraid. Cornelius took the stand on the second day, and Eleanor watched him testify against his own father with a steadiness that must have cost him everything he had left. His voice only breaking once when the prosecutor asked him directly whether he loved his father still. "I do," Cornelius said quiet, and the whole courtroom went still to hear it. "That's rather the trouble with all of this. I love him, and I cannot forgive what he did, and I have found there is no way to hold both of those things at once without it costing you something you don't ever fully get back." The jury took less than 2 hours to convict. Josiah Hale was sentenced to hang for the murder of Amos Beecher. The attempted murder charge for Nathaniel's carriage folded into the same proceeding. The judge calling it, in his closing remarks, one of the most calculated and cold-blooded conspiracies this county has seen in a generation of otherwise peaceable business between good families. Nathaniel didn't attend the sentencing. He'd told Eleanor the night before that he had no wish to watch a man die, even a man who'd tried to take everything from him. "I want to be the kind of man who moves forward," he said, "not the kind who needs to watch his enemy fall to feel like he's won something." Eleanor understood and didn't push him, and sat alone in that courtroom on his behalf, carrying the verdict back to him herself that evening, finding him once again out behind the cottage, further along the rails than he'd been the week before. "It's finished," she told him. "Guilty on every charge." Nathaniel was quiet a long moment, his hands still gripping the rail, his breath slowly evening out. "8 months," he said finally. 8 months I spent hating the world for what happened to me. And it turns out, the world didn't do this. One greedy, frightened man did, and now he'll answer for it. And none of it gives me my legs back the way they were. And none of it undoes what Amos Beecher's children lost. He looked up at her. "I thought justice would feel like triumph. Mostly it just feels like grief finally getting somewhere to land." "That's allowed," Eleanor said. "Grief doesn't need to feel like triumph to be real." Margaret Whitmore's thaw came slower than Edmund's, but it came. Eleanor found her mother one afternoon in the parlor, turning something over in her hands, a small framed silhouette of Eleanor as a girl, dark curls and a stubborn chin. Even at 8 years old, and something in her mother's face when she looked up made Eleanor pause in the doorway. "I heard," Margaret said, "that the Ashford boy is walking again. A little. With rails, your father says." "He is. Slowly." "I owe you an apology," Margaret said, and the words seemed to cost her physically, her hands tightening around the little frame. "I called you a fool for what you did in that ballroom. I told you that you'd ruined this family's future over a cripple's pity." "Mother, you don't have to. Let me finish, Eleanor. I don't do this easily." Margaret set the frame down, folded her hands in her lap, composed herself the way she always did before saying something difficult. "I watched a girl of 24 see something the rest of us were too comfortable to look at directly. I was so afraid of what people would say about this family that I very nearly talked you out of doing the one right thing in that entire ballroom. I have thought about that a great deal these past weeks, and I find I am ashamed of it." Eleanor crossed the room and sat beside her mother, something unfamiliar and tender moving between them. "You were frightened," Eleanor said, "for the family. I understand that better now than I did that night. Frightened women make cruel choices sometimes," Margaret said. "I have made a great many of them over the years and called it wisdom because it was easier than calling it fear." She reached over and took Eleanor's hand, and gesture so unlike her that Eleanor nearly startled. "I should like to meet him properly. Mr. Ashford, not as a scandal or a cripple or a mistake I warned you against, as the man my daughter loves. He'd like that," Eleanor said, throat tight. "He's better company than his reputation ever gave him credit for." "Most interesting people are," Margaret said, and for the first time in longer than Eleanor could remember, her mother's smile reached all the way to her eyes. The dinner, when it finally happened, went better than Eleanor had dared hope, and worse than she'd feared in the particular way of all family dinners that carry more weight than the food on the table. Edmund and Nathaniel discovered to everyone's surprise a shared passion for horses that carried them through 2 full courses without a single awkward silence. Margaret asked careful, correct questions about the schoolhouses Nathaniel had built, and seemed genuinely startled to learn the full extent of what he'd done with his fortune, long before the accident ever touched him. It was only after the meal, when Nathaniel and Edmund had stepped out onto the porch for air, that Margaret caught Eleanor alone in the hallway, her face gone serious again. "He asked your father something out there," she said, "before you came looking for them. I only caught the tail end of it through the window." Eleanor's heart gave a hard, sudden lurch. "What did he ask?" "I believe," Margaret said, and something almost mischievous flickered beneath her careful composure. "You had best go find out yourself." Eleanor found them on the porch steps, her father standing with his hands clasped behind his back in the particular posture he used for serious business conversations. Nathaniel sitting in his chair beside him, both of them going quiet the moment she appeared. "What were you two discussing?" she asked, suspicion and hope tangling together in her chest. Edmund cleared his throat, glanced at Nathaniel, and excused himself back inside with a haste that fooled absolutely no one, leaving Eleanor alone with Nathaniel in the cooling evening air, crickets starting up in the hedges the way they had the very first night she'd wheeled him out of that ballroom. "Nathaniel, I asked your father's permission," Nathaniel said, and his voice had gone rough with nerves in a way she'd never heard from him before, not even facing down Josiah Hale on that lawn. "Before I asked you anything myself," seemed the proper order of things even for 2 people who've already thrown most of proper order out the window since the night we met. Eleanor's breath caught. Permission for what? Nathaniel reached for her hand, and though his legs still couldn't carry him the way they once had, though the rails behind the cottage still measured his progress in feet rather than miles, there was nothing broken at all in the steadiness of his voice. "I've spent 8 months believing I was less than I used to be," he said. "Believing a man in a chair had no business asking anything of a woman like you. You taught me different, one stubborn, reckless afternoon at a time, and I find I am done waiting to become whole again before I let myself want the things a whole man wants." His hand tightened around hers. "I don't know how many feet I'll walk by winter, Eleanor. I don't know if I'll ever ride the way I used to, or stand at an altar without a hand on the rail beside me. But I know exactly what I want standing beside me when I get there, however far that turns out to be." Eleanor felt tears rise fast, and sudden her whole chest full to bursting with something she didn't have a single word large enough to hold. "Nathaniel, let me finish," he said. Half a laugh caught in his throat. "I've been building up my nerve on this since sometime around the second time I fell in that grass, and you refused to leave me be about it." He drew a small ring from his coat pocket, plain, unshowy, nothing like the kind of ring a Hale family bride might have worn. "Marry me. Not because I need saving, and not because you need rescuing from a life you never wanted. Marry me because I have never in my life met anyone who looked at what was broken in me and saw something worth kneeling down for, instead of walking past." Eleanor knelt down then, exactly the way she had that first night in the ballroom, so her eyes were level with his, and this time there was no crowd watching, no whispers, no cruel laughter waiting to fill the silence. Only the 2 of them and the crickets, and the whole wide unwritten shape of whatever came next. "Yes," she said. "I will." The engagement lasted 3 weeks before someone tried to destroy it. Eleanor supposed she ought to have expected it. Nothing in the last 4 months had arrived without a cost attached, without some hand reaching in from the edges of the story to snatch back whatever small piece of peace she and Nathaniel had managed to carve out together. She'd grown almost accustomed to it. The way you grow accustomed to bad weather in a Massachusetts summer, you stop being surprised and start simply watching the sky. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, addressed to her father in a hand she didn't recognize, sealed with no family crest, no return address. Nothing to mark it as anything but ordinary correspondence. Edmund read it at the breakfast table, and she knew something was wrong before he'd finished the first page, because his coffee went cold beside him, untouched, and Edmund Whitmore had never in his life let a hot cup of coffee go to waste. "Father," she kept her voice level. "What is it?" He set the letter face down on the tablecloth and looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been hoping to spare someone something and had just run out of road. "It appears," he said carefully, "that Josiah Hale was not the only member of that family keeping records of his arrangements." Eleanor's blood went cold. "What kind of records?" Edmund turned the letter over, slid it across to her, and Eleanor picked it up with hands that stayed steadier than she felt. The handwriting was small, precise, the kind a clerk or an accountant would produce, and the contents were brief and ugly, a list of dates, amounts, and names, all purporting to document payments made by Edmund Whitmore himself to Josiah Hale over a period of 5 years. Not loan repayments, the letter claimed, but payments in exchange for favorable treatment at the Boston Harbor Trade Authority, for permits expedited for competitors, quietly disadvantaged for the quiet burial of inspections that might otherwise have found the Whitmore ships wanting. The letter's final paragraph was not signed, but its meaning was plain enough. These records exist in more than one place. Should the Whitmore family proceed with the announced engagement to Nathaniel Ashford, whose testimony and connections now threaten further investigation of the Hale family's affairs, these documents will be delivered to the Trade Authority and the Boston Courier simultaneously. Should the engagement be quietly dissolved, the matter need not proceed further. Eleanor set the letter down. Her hands were shaking now. She couldn't help it. "Is it true?" she asked quiet. Edmund was silent a moment too long. "Father?" Her voice cracked on it. "Is it true?" "The payments were real," Edmund said, and his voice had gone hollow. A man landing somewhere he'd been dreading for a very long time. "The characterization of them is not it is not as simple as the letter makes it appear. Every man in shipping paid Josiah Hale something Eleanor in one form or another, for one favor or another. It was simply how business was conducted at that harbor for 20 years, and none of us asked too closely what form the favors took, because we were all profiting from the arrangement." "Father?" Eleanor pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth, a moment steadied herself, and looked her father in the eye. "Did you know what he was—" "Not about the accident," Edmund said. "Not about Beecher. I swear that to you, Eleanor, on your brother Thomas's grave. I didn't know he was capable of that. But the rest of it, the corruption at the harbor." He looked down at his hands. "I chose not to ask the questions that would have told me the answer. And now someone who is still loyal to what's left of that family has decided to make me pay for it. The worst of it, the thing that sat in Eleanor's stomach like a stone for the rest of that long morning, was that she understood it completely. Her father's weakness wasn't villainy. It was the exact same comfortable blindness she'd seen in every person who'd walked a wide circle around Nathaniel's chair in that ballroom. The choice not to look too directly at something uncomfortable, because looking directly would require doing something about it, and doing something about it had a cost. She told Nathaniel that afternoon, rode out to the manor rather than the mill cottage, because this was the kind of conversation that needed a room with a closed door behind it. He read the letter twice without speaking, and when he looked up, his jaw was set in that particular tight way she'd come to know meant he was keeping his voice even by force of will. "This is someone inside the Hale household," he said. "Someone with access to Josiah's private records who is still loyal enough to use them and smart enough to aim them where they'll do the most damage." Could it be Cornelius? "Cornelius burned his own house down to put his father away," Nathaniel said. "This is someone trying to save what's left of the ashes." He set the letter on the table between them. "We need to know who it is before we can decide what to do about it." "That could take weeks," Eleanor said. "They've given no indication of how long we have before they act." "Then we don't wait for weeks," Nathaniel said. "Eleanor, I need you to listen to me carefully. Your father made mistakes. Real ones. And I won't pretend that letter doesn't complicate things, because it does, and anyone who tells you different is lying. But I will not dissolve this engagement. Not for that letter, Not for whoever sent it, not for anything short of you telling me yourself that you want it dissolved." "I don't want that," Eleanor said fiercely. "Good. Then we fight it." He reached across the table and took her hand. Together. Same as everything else. They went to Cornelius the next morning. Both of them, Eleanor and Nathaniel, arriving at the rooms above the printer's shop before Cornelius had finished his breakfast, and they laid the letter on his table, alongside his half-eaten toast, and watched his face work through surprise recognition, and then a cold, specific fury. "Fletcher," Cornelius said. "Who?" Eleanor asked. "Gerald Fletcher, my father's private secretary for 15 years. Kept every record Josiah ever made in triplicate in a locked cabinet in the east wing of the house." Cornelius pushed back from the table, ran both hands through his hair. "When my father was arrested, Fletcher disappeared. I assumed he'd fled the association. Now I think he was making copies." "Why would he do this?" Nathaniel asked. "What does he gain from threatening the Whitmore family?" "Fletcher wasn't loyal to my father for principle," Cornelius said. "He was loyal for pay. My father paid him extremely well for 15 years, and now that salary is gone, the house is in litigation, and Fletcher has no income and a great deal of dangerous knowledge. This isn't about protecting the Hale family." His voice went flat and tired. "This is a man who's decided his knowledge is worth money, and he's testing the price." Eleanor stared at him. "He's blackmailing us." "He's blackmailing your father," Cornelius corrected. "Your engagement is only the lever he's using because he knows you'll feel the threat most personally through that." He looked at Nathaniel directly then, and something passed between the two men, the particular look of people who've stood on opposite sides of something terrible and found themselves unexpectedly on the same ground. "What he doesn't know, what I suspect he hasn't thought through, is that I also know about those harbor payments. And so does my father's defense attorney, and so do 3 members of the Trade Authority Investigation Committee who are presently working their way through every document Josiah ever produced." "Meaning," Eleanor said, "meaning Fletcher's leverage is already compromised," Cornelius said. "If those records go to the Courier, they go into a public conversation that's already happening. The Trade Authority investigation has already turned up half that corruption on its own. Edmund Whitmore won't be the only name on the list, and won't be the worst name on the list, and the fact that he cooperated fully with the Hale prosecution will count for something in front of the committee. Fletcher's threat isn't the weapon he thinks it is." "You'd testify to that?" Nathaniel asked. "Publicly, if it came to it." "Nathaniel." Cornelius looked at him steadily. "I testified against my own father in open court. I believe I've established I'm willing to say difficult things when they need saying." Yeah. Fletcher was found within 4 days living in rented rooms in the north end of Boston under a name that took the inquiry agent Nathaniel hired all of 48 hours to see through. The agent arrived at Fletcher's door with Cornelius in tow and a letter signed by the Trade Authority investigator confirming that any records in Fletcher's possession were already considered part of an active proceeding, and that individuals attempting to leverage such records for personal financial gain would find themselves liable for obstruction. Fletcher folded like paper in rain. He produced every copy, surrendered them to the investigator, and signed a statement confirming that the payments documented therein were part of a harbor-wide corruption scheme orchestrated by Josiah Hale, in which dozens of Boston's shipping families had participated under varying degrees of coercion and knowledge. Edmund Whitmore's name appeared on the list, and it stayed there. Eleanor never asked for it to be removed, and Edmund, when she told him, said only quietly that he was glad it had. "I don't deserve to be protected from the consequences of what I chose to look away from," he said. "Whatever the committee decides, I'll live with it. That's the proper order of things." He was fined substantially, along with 14 other shipping merchants, and placed under a 2-year review of his harbor permits. It was not ruin. It was consequence, which was different, and he bore it with a dignity Eleanor hadn't entirely expected, and found herself proud of in a way that surprised her with its depth. The summer moved on, And with it, Nathaniel's legs moved too slow and stubborn, and more every week the way rivers move against their own current when something upstream changes. Not fast, not dramatic, not the sudden miraculous restoration the gossip around Boston kept wanting to make of it, but real and honest and entirely his own. 6 feet became 10, 10 became 20. He fell often enough that Eleanor stopped counting the falls and started counting the times he got back up, which was every single time without exception. By August, he could cross a room without the rails, one hand on the furniture, slow and deliberate, as a man learning the floor of a new house. His doctor, a careful Boston physician named Aldrich, who'd been skeptical from the start about the permanence of the injury, came out to the manor one afternoon in late summer and sat with Nathaniel for an hour, running his hands over the muscles of his legs with an expression of growing reluctant astonishment. "I told you 8 months ago," Aldrich said, "that I'd seen worse cases recover more than anyone expected. You didn't believe me." "I wasn't ready to believe you," Nathaniel said. "What changed?" Nathaniel glanced at Eleanor sitting across the room, pretending to read, quite obviously not reading. "I had something to get back to," he said simply. Aldrich followed his gaze and nodded with the air of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what love could do to a man's body, when his mind finally got out of the way. Margaret Whitmore threw herself into the wedding preparations with the particular ferocity of a woman making amends through logistics. Within a week of the engagement's formal announcement, delayed by the Fletcher affair, and now released in the Courier, with a dignity that made the society pages read it twice, she had engaged a dressmaker commissioned. The church consulted 3 separate caterers, and written enough correspondence to fill a diplomatic packet. Eleanor found her at the dining room table one evening, surrounded by fabric samples and seating charts, looking more genuinely alive than Eleanor had seen her in years. "You're enjoying this," Eleanor said, surprised enough to say it out loud. Margaret looked up, a little caught. "I enjoy being useful," she said, which was close enough to the truth that Eleanor let it stand. "Besides," her mother added softer, "I spent a great deal of time making your life difficult this past year. I would like to spend some time making it pleasant, if you'll allow me." "I'll allow you," Eleanor said, and sat down beside her mother in the middle of the fabric samples, and didn't mind the seating chart at all. And the twist came from the last direction Eleanor had thought to look, because the last month had been so relentlessly forward-moving, so full of small daily victories stacking up like timber for a fire, that she'd stopped bracing quite as hard for the blow that might come sideways. It came on a warm Thursday afternoon in early September, in the form of a letter delivered directly to Nathaniel at the manor, sealed with the crest of a Boston law firm she didn't recognize. She was there when he opened it, sitting beside him in the parlor, and she watched his face change as he read, going from puzzlement to stillness to something that took her a long moment to name: grief. Old specific grief, the kind that doesn't arrive fresh but returns from somewhere. It's been kept waiting. "What is it?" she asked. He handed her the letter without speaking. It was from an attorney representing the estate of a man named James Calloway, recently deceased, formerly of Philadelphia, formerly, and here was the word that made Eleanor's breath go, formerly the driver of Nathaniel Ashford's carriage on the night of the accident in question. The driver. The man who had been on that box seat when the carriage went off the road at Miller's Creek. Eleanor had never thought to ask about him, had somehow, in all the investigation and testimony and courtroom drama, never thought to ask what had happened to the man holding the reins that night. The letter explained. James Calloway had been thrown from the box seat when the carriage went over. He'd survived broken arm and broken collarbone, but Josiah Hale's people had reached him within 48 hours while he was still bedridden and frightened, and made him an offer he'd described in his own words in the letter's attached document. They said they would pay for my recovery and my passage to Philadelphia if I signed a paper saying I'd seen nothing unusual on that road before the axle broke. They said if I didn't sign, they'd tell the sheriff I'd been the one to tamper with the wheel and caused the accident myself. I was a hired man. Nobody would take my word over theirs. I signed. He'd carried it 40 years, no. Eleanor corrected herself, reading on 8 months. 8 months that had evidently felt like 40 years to a man lying in Philadelphia, with that knowledge. And when Josiah Hale was convicted, Calloway had gone to his attorney and made a full statement, wanting the record corrected while he still could, because he was ill. His attorney said genuinely ill, the kind of illness that made a man think about the accounting he'd have to give at the end. He'd died 6 days after giving the statement. Nathaniel sat very still beside Eleanor for a long time after she'd finished reading. The letter rested between them on the parlor table, and neither of them spoke, because some things needed to sit in silence for a moment before words could be built around them. He was frightened, Nathaniel said finally. A working man alone in a strange county with a broken arm and Josiah Hale's people standing over his bed. He did what frightened people do. "You're not angry at him?" Eleanor asked, honestly uncertain. "I'm angry," Nathaniel said. "Not at him. At the machine of it, the way Josiah was already moving, already covering his tracks before the wheels of my carriage had stopped turning in that creek bed. Before I'd even woken up to know what had happened to me, there was a man in a sickbed being threatened into silence." His voice had roughened, but he held it steady. "I want to write to his family. Whatever money he took to leave, I want to replace it. His children shouldn't carry the burden of what their father was forced into." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. This man, this same man who, 8 months ago, couldn't cross a room, couldn't look a neighbor in the eye, couldn't bring himself to believe he deserved to occupy the space his life had always occupied, and felt something in her chest open so wide it frightened her with its size. "Do you know," she said, "that you are the best man I have ever known in my life?" Nathaniel looked at her sideways, something almost like his old easy humor surfacing through the grief. "I'm a man in a chair who's recently relearned to cross a room and spend my evenings writing letters to the families of people I never met. The bar may not be as high as you're making it sound." "Don't do that," Eleanor said firmly. "Don't undercut it when I mean it. You are a good man, Nathaniel Ashford. Receive the compliment." He was quiet a moment, and then something settled in his face. Something that had been tense and uncertain for so long, finally finding its resting place. "Yes, ma'am," he said soft, and took her hand. The letter to James Calloway's family in Philadelphia went out the following week, hand-delivered by a trusted man of Nathaniel's, carrying a bank draft, and a note that Eleanor helped Nathaniel draft over 2 evenings. 6 attempts, the waste paper basket filling up with false starts that were either too formal, or too sentimental, or too full of anger, neither of them quite knew what to do with. The final version was plain and honest and kind, and said what it needed to say, without asking anything of Calloway's family, except that they know the whole story now, and understand that the man they'd lost had done one frightened wrong thing in a life that Nathaniel hoped had held a great deal more right ones. Calloway's eldest son wrote back within the month. A brief letter stiff with the effort of a man unaccustomed to correspondence but genuine in a way that mattered more than eloquence. "My father prayed for Mr. Ashford every night for 8 months. He said he wasn't sure God was listening, but he tried anyway. I'm glad to know it wasn't all for nothing." Nathaniel kept that letter in his coat pocket for the rest of the summer. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of September, when the maples along the road to the church had just begun to turn, and the heat had gone golden and soft, the way New England heat did when it was preparing to leave for another year. Margaret had arranged everything with a thoroughness that bordered on military strategy, and Eleanor, standing in the church dressing room in the morning light, in a dress the color of new cream, with her hair put up more carefully than it had ever been put up in her life, felt something so uncomplicated and enormous moving through her that she had to press her hands flat against her own ribcage just to hold it. Her mother stood behind her, adjusting the last of the pins in her hair, and when Eleanor caught Margaret's eyes in the small mirror propped on the dressing table, she found them suspiciously bright. "Don't you dare cry, Mother," Eleanor said. "If you cry, I'll cry, and then I'll walk down that aisle red-nosed and ruined." "I am not crying," Margaret said firmly with the specific trembling chin of a woman who absolutely was. I am simply proud, which I have not said to you enough in your life, and which I intend to say considerably more often going forward, so you had best accustom yourself to it." Eleanor turned from the mirror and let her mother hold her briefly fiercely, in the way Margaret had always hugged, arms tight, spine straight, like she was afraid letting go would mean admitting she'd needed the embrace in the first place. "You raised me to be exactly what I am," Eleanor said into her mother's shoulder. "Whatever I am, you made." "Whatever you are," Margaret said, pulling back, already composing herself, hands busy with the dress's collar, "is better than anything I managed to plan for you, and I am woman enough to admit that freely." Edmund appeared in the doorway behind them, hat in his hands, and the look he gave his daughter was the plainest and most unguarded Eleanor had ever seen on his face in 24 years. "You look like your grandmother," he said. She would have been unspeakably proud. "And you?" Eleanor asked. Edmund cleared his throat. Twice glanced at the ceiling, a man fighting himself with the same stubborn energy his daughter had inherited without knowing it. "Unspeakably," he said finally, and offered her his arm. The church was full, which surprised Eleanor more than it ought to have. She'd half expected the lingering scandals, the trial, the Fletcher affair, her father's fine, the long strange year of it all to keep attendance thin and polite rather than genuine. Instead, she stepped into the doorway on her father's arm and found 300 faces turned toward her. Many of them, the same faces that had laughed in that ballroom 10 months ago, and found that the laughter was gone from every single one of them. At the front of the church, Nathaniel stood. He stood. Not in his chair, not holding the rail, not leaning on his manservant's arm. He stood alone at the end of the aisle, with one hand barely resting on the corner of the front pew, enough to steady without depending. And when Eleanor saw it, when the reality of it landed in her chest, she stopped walking. Her father's arm tightened under her hand. "Eleanor, give me a moment," she said, not trusting her voice past that, because she had not known he was going to try to stand. He hadn't told her he would try, hadn't promised. It hadn't even hinted she understood now that he'd been attempting it in private, probably for weeks, keeping it back in case he couldn't manage it, not wanting to offer her something, and then have to take it back. And here he was, upright, real, one hand just barely touching the wood of the pew, his face a complicated mixture of effort and pride, and the particular terror of a man who has bet everything on one moment and is in the middle of finding out whether he wins. She started walking again, faster than she meant to, faster than was probably dignified, not quite running, but close enough that she heard her mother make a small sound behind her that might have been a laugh. When she reached him, he exhaled like he'd been holding that breath since morning. "You didn't tell me," she said low, just for him. "Wanted to see your face when you found out," he said, and his voice was rough with everything he was holding back, and also unmistakably with the effort it was taking to stay upright, which made her love him more, rather than less. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Ask me again in an hour," he said. "Right now I need you to hold my hand before my legs decide they've had enough of showing off." She took his hand and felt him press back hard and certain. And when the minister began to speak, Eleanor stood beside Nathaniel Ashford in front of 300 witnesses, and a God she wasn't always sure of, but was grateful for today, and understood that this specific moment, this man, this hand in hers, was the answer to every question she'd been living inside since the night she'd looked across a ballroom and refused to look away. Oh, the vows were the traditional ones, and Eleanor had always thought she'd find them too formal, too old, and worn smooth by 1,000 other mouths to carry any personal weight. Instead, when Nathaniel spoke them to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, she heard each word, land fresh and specific, weighted with everything the last 10 months had already put those words through before they were ever asked to say them at an altar. In sickness and in health. She nearly laughed a watery, full-hearted laugh she swallowed hard against her back teeth. When it was her turn, she held both his hands and looked at him directly the way she did everything without flinching, without prettifying it into something easier than it was, and said the words like she was stating a fact she'd already proven. When the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," and Nathaniel bent his head and kissed her in front of everyone who had laughed, and everyone who hadn't, and everyone who'd spent 10 months deciding what the two of them were capable of. Eleanor kissed him back with every ounce of the same stubborn, clear-eyed determination she'd walked across a ballroom with and heard the church erupt around them in a sound that had nothing apologetic in it. So, the reception was held at the manor the first time in nearly a year. The big house had been opened for a gathering, and Eleanor watched Nathaniel navigate it from across the room in the early part of the evening. The way he moved through a crowd, now slower than before, but no less present. The way people came to him rather than avoiding him, the way he looked them in the eye and let them come. Not performing ease, but actually finding it, which was different, and took more than a man who hadn't been practicing for 10 months would have known. Cornelius arrived late quietly and stood for a long time at the edge of the room, as though uncertain of his welcome. It was Nathaniel who spotted him and moved across the room toward him, and Eleanor watched them shake hands. The man who'd been crippled, and the man whose family had done the crippling, and held her breath through the moment it took for both of them to find the ground on the other side of that history. "Thank you for coming," Nathaniel said. "I wasn't certain I should," Cornelius said. "I wasn't certain you'd want me here. I invited you, didn't I?" "You did. I just wanted to give you a chance to regret it before I came all the way inside." Nathaniel almost smiled. "You testified against your own father to put him in prison for what he did to me. If you think that doesn't buy you a glass of wine and a slice of wedding cake, you have a very poor understanding of how debts work." Cornelius laughed, surprised out of it, and some of the hollowness went out of his face, and the two of them stood together, talking for the better part of an hour, while Eleanor watched from across the room, and thought that this two people finding their way to honest ground after everything that had tried to keep them from it was the part the gossip columns would never get right, and the part that mattered most. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had drifted toward the warmth of the dining room, and the music had gone soft and easy, Eleanor found Nathaniel standing alone near the window, weight leaned just slightly against the frame, looking out at the darkened garden. "You ought to sit," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Your legs have done extraordinary things today. You're allowed to let them rest." "In a minute," he said. "I just wanted to stand here for a minute, on my own 2 feet in my own house next to my wife." He said the last word like he was testing the weight of it, finding it good. "Seems worth standing for." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a while, neither of them said anything, which was one of the great privileges of being with someone you trusted. The silence was as full as the conversation. "What are you thinking?" she asked finally. "I'm thinking," Nathaniel said, "about the man I was a year ago, sitting in the corner of his own house like a man waiting to be told his time was up, letting everybody in Boston decide what he was and wasn't capable of, including himself." He paused. "And I'm thinking about the fool woman who walked across a ballroom and knelt down in front of me in a room full of people who thought she'd lost her mind." "I hadn't lost my mind," Eleanor said. "I'd found it, actually. Most people confuse the two." Nathaniel's laugh was low and warm, and he turned from the window and pressed his lips to the top of her head, easy and certain, the gesture of a man who had stopped being careful about allowing himself the things he wanted. "You saved me," he said. "Don't," Eleanor said, pulling back just enough to look at him. "You saved yourself. Every morning you went back out to those rails. Every time you fell and got up. Every time you chose not to disappear into that house and become the ghost everybody expected. I was just the person standing nearby when you decided to stop believing them." "Then you were the most important thing," Nathaniel said simply, and she couldn't argue with that, so she didn't. Teg. In the months that followed, the months that turned the story of Eleanor and Nathaniel from a scandal into something the county eventually told with a kind of proprietary pride, as if they'd always known how it would come out. Several things resolved themselves with the quiet permanence of things properly settled. Amos Beecher's widow received through a discreet arrangement that Nathaniel and Eleanor set up together a monthly sum sufficient to raise her 4 children in comfort pay for the eldest boy's schooling, and keep the roof above their heads without their ever needing to depend on the charity of the family whose patriarch had stolen their husband and father from them. The widow sent a single letter of acknowledgment, brief and dignified, signed with the same steady hand as the note she'd pressed into Eleanor's keeping in that fabric shop, and Eleanor kept it in the small cedar box on her dressing table, where she kept the things that mattered most. The schoolhouses. The four of them, silent and unclaimed all these years, with no Ashford name on any plaque, got their plaques at last, not with Nathaniel's name alone, but with both of theirs, because Eleanor had been the one to say a building that stands for 100 years ought to tell the truth of who built it, and Nathaniel had not argued. Edmund Whitmore completed his 2-year review. Without further incident, his ships restored to full harbor access, at the conclusion a quieter and more careful man than he'd been before the whole long year of it, and not worse for the change. He and Nathaniel developed over many dinners a friendship rooted in horses and practical honesty that Eleanor had not anticipated and was entirely glad of. Margaret Whitmore, freed from the social calculations of a daughter's unmarried future, became, and this was the part Eleanor would tell for the rest of her life as the thing that surprised her most, a genuine friend. Not only her mother, but someone she sought out. Someone who said useful things and sharp, true things, and occasionally very funny things that Eleanor had never known lived behind all those years of careful social management. The woman who'd gripped her arm and hissed, "Do not kneel down in this ballroom," was also. It turned out the woman who would sit up till midnight discussing everything that had happened since and always ask the right question one beat ahead of where Eleanor thought the conversation was going. Cornelius Hale rebuilt his life with a slowness that was almost architectural, one honest brick at a time. He never recovered his family's fortune and did not try. He became instead what he'd perhaps always been underneath the wealth and the calculation, a capable, precise man who was very good at looking at complicated situations clearly and saying difficult things plainly, qualities which served him extremely well when he eventually joined the law office that had handled the trade authority investigation and began working as an advocate for cases where ordinary people had been defrauded by powerful ones. Eleanor ran into him occasionally in the years after, always briefly, always cordially, and always came away from the exchange feeling that the Cornelius who had stepped off that platform at the festival was the truest version of the man she'd met, and that the platform had been the making of him rather than the destruction. The first winter of the marriage was hard in the particular way of first winter's unfamiliar rhythms, small frictions of two people learning the dailiness of each other, the fact that love in the abstract and love in the morning before coffee are not always identical. Nathaniel was often in pain. He didn't say enough about until Eleanor learned to read his silences, and Eleanor was often stubborn past the point of usefulness, and there were 2 or 3 arguments in that first winter that went on long enough to fill a room before they finally found the other side of them. But they always found the other side. That was the thing. Neither of them had any interest in performing a happiness they didn't feel, and both of them had spent enough of their lives around people who did to know the difference. And so when something was hard between them, they said so and worked at it with the same stubborn, determined energy they'd brought to everything else, until it wasn't hard anymore, or was hard in a way they'd learned to carry together. By spring, Nathaniel had graduated from one-handed wall-holding to a walking stick he carried more out of caution than necessity, and his doctor said with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd learned never to define the ceiling of a determined patient's recovery, that there was no reason to expect the progress to stop where it had gotten to, and every reason to expect it to keep surprising them. The day Nathaniel walked from the front door of the manor to the stables and back again, a distance of nearly a quarter mile. Unassisted, slow, the cane barely touching the ground by the return trip. Eleanor was watching from the parlor window, and when he came back inside, sweaty and triumphant, and looking like a man who'd just personally argued down God about the terms of his own fate, she crossed the room and held on to him for a long time without saying anything at all, and he held on to her back, and whatever it was that passed between them in that moment needed no translation. On the first anniversary of the night, Eleanor had crossed a ballroom and knelt down in front of a man the whole world had decided was finished. They went back, not to a scandal or a gathering or a social performance. To the same ballroom, now host to a different winter party, for a different season's worth of new faces and old money, and they walked in together. Eleanor on Nathaniel's arm, Nathaniel with his cane and his straight back, and the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had spent a year rebuilding his right to take up the space he occupied. And if the room noticed them and murmured, it was a different kind of murmur from the one that had followed them out of that same room a year ago. They danced, not the careful, slow turning of a chair that the fiddler had found music for a year ago, but a real dance slower than it used to be, closer than strictly proper, Nathaniel's weight redistributed in ways that changed the shape of it, but not its meaning. Eleanor felt his hand at her waist, and his other hand holding hers, and his breath evening out above her head as he concentrated, and she followed him without making it obvious she was following, which was a kind of grace she'd had to learn too. "You're counting," she said into his shoulder. "I'm not counting," he said. "You're counting, Nathaniel. Your lips are moving." A pause. "I am counting a little, M." Eleanor laughed, and he laughed too, and they kept dancing slow and real and unperformed in the middle of a room full of watching eyes, and nobody in that room laughed, and nobody looked away. And Eleanor understood that this was what winning actually looked like, not the hammer blow of a verdict, not the drama of a public confrontation, but this ordinary moment of two people choosing each other so completely that the opinion of a room full of strangers had simply stopped being a thing that could reach them. When the music ended, Nathaniel leaned down and said low in her ear, "I'd have danced with you that first night, you know, if I'd believed even for a moment that I still deserved to." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I had to ask you first." He pulled back to look at her, and there was something in his face so unguarded and full, and finally completely at rest, that it made her breath catch the way it had in that church doorway when she'd seen him standing. "You are the best thing that ever walked across a room toward me," he said. Eleanor Whitmore. Ashford looked at the man she'd chosen in front of a laughing crowd, and a frightened family, and a county that had been certain she was wrong, and knew with absolute certainty, the way you know the things that have been tested against everything, and held that she would make the same choice again in every room, in every life, in every version of that ballroom this world could ever build. "I know that too," she said. "That's why I kept walking." And she had been right about him from the very first step, and she was right about him still, and she would be right about him for every year that came after, because some truths once seen clearly do not need to be rediscovered. They simply need to be lived.